So what we're going to do this morning is pack out the Cush Drive. This is my 2015 DL 650. It's only got about 11,000 Ks on it, but already I can start to feel a little bit of slack in the Cush Drive. So what I'm going to do is show you how to fix some spacers and put them in the Cush Drive so that you don't have any more slack in there. Okay, so it's a pretty simple job. Removing the back wheel, just leave everything placed in a position where it's easy to clean up and you know exactly where they have to go back on the bike again. So the Cush Drive, we'll open that up now and show you what that's all about. Okay, so we've got the back wheel off, and it's a great opportunity for you to have a good look at the tyre, make sure that you don't have any cracks, splits, tears or anything like that. Also your spokes, make sure your spokes are all pretty good, not bent or missing. And to get to our Cush Drive, what we've got to do is lift the sprocket housing out. Careful of your spacers. And you can see how this works. These are rubber pads in here. The rubber pads pretty much stop the shock of wrapping on your throttle from going straight through to your back wheel from the chain. So that's why it's called a Cush Drive. Gives you a little bit of cushion. You don't have that snap on off throttle. So you can see that in the end you get a little bit of wear on these Cush pads, and of course they just start to loosen up just a fraction, and you'll feel just the slightest bit of snap on your sprocket sometimes, or just fractionally loose, as if your chain's loose almost. Okay, so we've got our sprocket off. Put that aside. Need to make sure you take a photo or something like that of where these little Cush pads sit and how they sit, because you've got to put them all back in the same. So what we're going to do, they've got a little rubber grommet on the bottom that seats into the hole in here. What we're going to do is cut some plastic that are about the size of where you can see this Cush is making contact with the wheel itself, and we're going to fit those in there so that it spaces them on each side. And if you do that for all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of your Cush Drives, you end up with a much tighter fit for your sprocket and a much better response from the Cush Drive. Okay, we'll cut up some plastic spacers now and put those in. Alright, another thing you need to make sure of is when you put this rear wheel down on the ground, make sure that you've got your rotor down on something soft so it's not going to get scratched or marked. As I said before, it's a good opportunity to check your wheel bearings. Just get a clean finger in there, turn your bearing, make sure there's no play, make sure it doesn't feel gritty or anything like that. If it does, you're going to need new wheel bearings, and while you've got the wheel off, it's the best time to do it. Also, having this the rotor down on there stops anything from happening to your ABS disc as well. Okay, same thing with the other bearing in there. Make sure that there's no play in it, there's no grit, there's no water, and it feels really nice and smooth without any play whatsoever. It's also, you need to make sure that you clean anything out around here, around near the bearing housing. Make sure that nothing's going to get in there. In fact, what we should do is put some rag in here as well, just to stop any grit from getting in there while we're working on it, pulling these push pads in and out. You can see the dirt that's in and around there. You don't want that getting down into your bearings. Alright, we've also got this yogurt container that we're going to use to cut up for our spacers. We'll whiz through that in a minute, and we'll cut all the spacers up, and I'll show you how to put those in and put everything back together. So as you can see, quite a lot of crap in there, so I'm actually going to give these a good wash and clean these out as well. You know, while you're there, you might as well do it properly, get rid of all that crap before we put the spacers in. Okay, now that we've cleaned up all of this, well, as best as we can. I'd probably do a better job normally, but as you can see, it's the wet season. There's a lot more grit and grime to come, so I'm not going to bother detailing everything. But we've cleaned up our the Cush Drive mounts. We've cleaned up the push rubbers themselves, and we've cleaned up the sprocket and the Cush Drive mount. Okay, now that we've cleaned all this up, and it's not just about being anal, it's about making sure if you can have a good look around in here and make sure that there's no cracks or any failures beginning to happen. Same with your sprocket. You can have a look, see if there's any cracks or anything like that. You'll have a look here, here and here. They're imperfections, not cracks, but you know, now that it's cleaned up, you can have a good look at it and make sure that they aren't cracks. Same thing again, you also get the opportunity, check your bearing, make sure that that's good. Alright, what we need to do now is put back all of these Cush rubbers. Lugs are pretty hard to get into the hole in the housing. Best thing to do, tiny bit of WD-40, just put it around the top of the lug. And press it home into place. So do that with each one. Don't get any WD-40 anywhere else. So I've pre-cut all of these spacers, and as you can see, if you combine them all, that's a fair bit of spacing there. So you might want to consider how much or how thick the spacers are, or the plastic is that you're using. This should be okay, but when you go to fit the sprocket back in there, it might be too tight. So you might have to cut out some new spacers. That will be a better size. So all you're going to do is slide these spacers in there now. I've cut them out so that they'll fit in there pretty snug. Just put one on each side of the push rubber. Slide them down. And repeat that process with each one. If your push rubber happens to be pretty worn or pretty chewed out, putting these spacers in really isn't going to make any difference. You probably need to replace the push rubber. This is just a temporary fix to stop any slack that you may have in the push rubber. But you'll get twice the mileage, generally speaking, out of these push rubbers by putting those spacers in there, which will save you some money, and it's good therapy. All your push rubbers and spacers in, a little bit of grease on this spacer between the wheel, the sprocket bearing and the wheel bearing. line up your lugs. And seat your sprocket home. And as you can see, it was a much tighter fit. Weather seals on the wheel bearings. I've already cleaned this one out. Pretty much what I do, get a screwdriver with a soft clean cloth. You can see there's about 3 O-ring seals in there, and I just clean them out like so, very gently. You don't want to tear these, or that's the end of your wheel bearings. So I've already done that. So what I'm going to do now is just get a tiny amount of grease and I'm going to fill up the gap in those little seal rings in the weather seal, so that when our main spacer goes into here, when we're fitting the back wheel back onto the axle, you've got a nice grease weather seal around the axle. Alright, the rest is pretty simple. It's just putting the back wheel back on the bike. That's going to be specific to your bike, so let's see how we go. Adjusting the chain, yeah, it's relatively easy, but a kind of a black art, black science, voodoo, whatever you want to call it. From this point where we've actually taken the wheel off, what we need to do is tighten it up a little bit, just so you can see that the swing arm is coming in contact with the brake caliper. The brake caliper mount, your spacers, goes into the weather seal, and also around this side, your other weather seal spacer. You can see that there's still a bit of a gap just there between the swing arm and that weather seal. What we want to do is just tighten the axle bolt up enough so that that gap has gone. Alright, so if we have a look at that again now, you can see that there is virtually no gap there. Why? Because if you adjust your chain before there is tension on the axle and the axle bolt, when you go to do up your axle bolt, you'll find that the chain will actually tighten up a bit. So it'll be actually over tight. It's quite common with a lot of bikes. Not all bikes, but a lot of bikes. So what we're going to do is what we've just done, is tighten up your axle bolt a little bit. Not so much that you can't adjust your chain tensioners, but enough so that it's taken up the slack in the swing arm and it starts to clamp your spacers and the bearings through the axle bolt and the nut. Alright, so now we need to adjust up the chain. You can actually see where it was last time. That little line down there is where this plate was. So we're looking at about 1, 2, 3, 4 on the 5th marker. So we're going to do that up to the 5th marker. About there. You can see where the plate has been before on the 5th marker. So again, I'll do the same thing. Okay, roughly where it should be. One of the things I do at this point as well is I get hold of the rear of the bike and I give that back tyre a good kick so that it seats the axle bolt back as far as it should be in your chain tensioner holders which are inside the swing arm. At least this is the DL650. It's going to be different for different bikes. Okay, rotate the wheel. Check your chain tension. Rotate the wheel again a couple of times. You will find loose and tight spots in your chain. That would probably be as tight as we want it. So again, we're just going to check these markers. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's pretty much right on the 5th. Same with the other side. These markers are never always perfect on any bike. Swing arms, these spacer bars and the markings themselves can all be skewy from the right side to the left side, so it's very difficult to actually use this method to make sure that your chain is perfectly tensioned and correctly aligned. Another quick way you can work that out is have a look at where the teeth are sitting inside the chain. If the teeth of the sprocket are relatively in the middle, there's a slight gap each side between each roller, then you've pretty much got it right. Rotate it a couple of times, you'll see that they're pretty well in the center of those rollers. So that's another way of telling that your chain is pretty much in alignment between your rear sprocket and your front main drive sprocket. Once you've got to that point, make sure that your adjusters both correct, both tight, and then you can move on to tightening up your axle bolt. You may have to, with some of them, take your other ring spanner, hold the other side, stop that from turning. Now, this is not holding the entire bike together, so you don't need to go crazy about how tight you have this bolt. Over tightening it, you're going to do some damage. This is a lock nut. You can see it's got an aluminium thread on the outside there. That will stop it from coming undone. So you don't need to go crazy. I think it's around about 70 foot-pounds, 70, 80 foot-pounds of pressure to torque them up. Give that wheel a rotate again. Should spin fairly freely. And it all looks pretty good. One last thing you do need to do after you've completely removed the wheel and put it back on again, you've been playing with brakes, the brake caliper, is if you have a look here, you can actually see that the calipers are not in contact with the rotor anymore. The reason for that is because I spread the brake pads to be able to get the rotor in there. So what we need to do now is pump the brakes. And you'll see that the brake pads now are as good as just in contact with the rotors. So you're ready to go, the brakes are ready to function. If I rode out of the driveway right now and I didn't pump those brakes and I went for the back brakes, nothing would happen until I pumped them. That's not a good position to put yourself in. Make sure you pump your rear brakes after you've taken the rear wheel out and put it back in. Because we cleaned the sprocket, we've got a dry sprocket, dry teeth, and that chain needed a little bit of oil anyway. So what we're going to do is just oil the chain now that we've put the back wheel on, make sure the tension is all correct, and oil it up. that's it. You can take it out for a test run now.